Missionaries from Syria went down to what then was referred to as the Kingdom of Aksum, which is in modern-day Ethiopia, and they brought with them a whole host of literature.
A new passage in the Ethiopian Bible has just surfaced, and what it reveals about Jesus' resurrection is deeply disturbing, not because it's strange or hard to believe, but because it's specific. It describes exactly what Jesus said and did in the 40 days after he rose from the dead. Teachings so politically dangerous that they were quietly stripped from the Bible the rest of the world was handed. The Western Church said almost nothing happened in those 40 days. The Ethiopian Bible says something very different. And once you hear what that passage actually contains, you will never read the resurrection story the same way again. The passage they never wanted you to read. Here's what nobody tells you about the resurrection story. In the Western Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the most important event in all of human history, receives almost no follow-up. The tomb is empty. Jesus appears briefly to his disciples. He ascends to heaven, and then silence. The story ends almost as fast as it begins. For billions of people, that silence has been accepted as the complete account. But it isn't. Inside the Ethiopian Orthodox Bible, a canon of 81 books, far older and far less touched by imperial influence than anything the Roman Church produced, there is a record of what actually happened in those 40 days between the resurrection and the ascension. It is a record of teaching so radical, so politically explosive, and so fundamentally different from the version the world received that they were effectively buried. Not destroyed, not burned, just kept, locked away in stone monasteries in a land the Roman Empire could never fully conquer. What Jesus said in those 40 days was not a gentle farewell. It was a warning, and it was aimed directly at the future of his own church. This is the passage. This is what it says. A Bible the world forgot. To understand why Ethiopia is the keeper of this, you need to understand something most people in the West were never taught. When Western Christians think of the Bible, they think of either the 66 books of the Protestant canon or the 73 books recognized by the Catholic Church. Those numbers feel fixed, permanent, like they've always been that way. They haven't. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church has always recognized 81 books. 81. That means there are entire texts considered holy by one of the oldest Christian communities on earth, that billions of people have never read, never heard of, and were never told to look for. Here's why this matters. The Ethiopian Church is not a breakaway sect. It is not a fringe movement. It is among the most ancient Christian institutions in existence, tracing its origins to the earliest centuries of the faith, long before the Council of Nicaea, long before Constantine, long before Rome decided which books were in and which books were out. The Garima Gospels, ancient Ethiopian manuscripts carbon-dated to as far back as the 4th century, are among the oldest surviving Christian texts anywhere in the world. They predate the Roman Church's official formation of the biblical canon. Let that sink in. The texts Ethiopia has been preserving are not late additions. They are not additions at all. They are what was there first, before Rome got involved. And here's the other thing they don't tell you. Ethiopia's Christianity did not develop under Roman influence. Surrounded by mountains and deserts largely inaccessible to imperial armies, Ethiopian Christianity evolved along its own path. It was shaped by Ge'ez, a Semitic language with linguistic roots shared by Aramaic, the actual language Jesus spoke. The Western Gospels were translated into Greek, the language of Rome. Ethiopian texts stayed closer to the Semitic source, less filtered, less shaped by imperial priorities. Closer, many scholars argue, to the original. For years, Western academics dismissed all of this as folklore, too obscure, too strange, and so it was ignored. But ignoring it did not make it disappear. The books Rome wanted erased. Here's what Rome actually did to these texts, and why. The most famous book preserved in the Ethiopian canon, and nowhere else, is the Book of Enoch. You may have heard the name. The Book of Enoch is directly referenced in the New Testament. The Epistle of Jude quotes from it. Yet it was removed from the Western biblical canon by the Roman Church. The reason is not a mystery. It tells a story that the early church leadership found deeply, structurally threatening. The Book of Enoch describes the Watchers, celestial beings who descended to earth, took human women as partners, and fathered a race of giants called the Nephilim. More dangerously, these fallen figures shared forbidden knowledge with humanity. The crafting of weapons, the secrets of the hidden world, the arts of war and deception. It is a story about divine beings who abused their power and unleashed chaos. For an institution that depended on projecting unquestioned divine order through its own hierarchy, this was not a story they wanted people reading. Ethiopia kept it anyway. The Ethiopian canon also includes the Book of Jubilees, sometimes called the Lesser Genesis, which retells the Genesis narrative with new detail and introduces a solar calendar that directly conflicts with the Roman ecclesiastical calendar. A community following a different calendar is a community that can't be fully synchronized, fully controlled, fully absorbed into an imperial religious system. And then there are 15 additional texts, entire books that exist in the Ethiopian Bible and nowhere else in mainstream Christianity. Texts offering a different account of early Christian history, one shaped by something other than the priorities of power. This is what Ethiopian monks have been guarding. Not folklore, not legend. The suppressed record of what early Christianity actually looked like before Rome decided what it was allowed to say. So the question becomes, if Ethiopia preserved these books, the ones Rome didn't want anyone reading, what did it preserve about the resurrection itself? If you're not subscribed yet, now is the moment. What Jesus actually said in those 40 days after he rose is the reason this channel exists. Subscribe before we go any further, because what comes next is the part they really did not want anyone to hear. 40 days the West never heard about. Here is where the passage opens up into something no Western gospel has ever recorded. The text is called the Mashafa Kidan, in English, the Book of the Covenant. It is a physical manuscript, handwritten in Ge'ez on treated parchment, copied generation after generation in highland monasteries, where the air is thin and the doors are thick, and outsiders are not welcome without permission. Ethiopian clergy regard it as direct documentary evidence of what Jesus taught his disciples during those 40 days. Not a metaphor, not a theological interpretation, a record. And the portrait of Jesus that emerges from the Mashafa Kidan looks almost nothing like the figure most Westerners were taught. Stop, because this matters. In the Western Gospels, the post-resurrection Jesus is almost deliberately understated. He appears in a locked room. He walks on the road to Emmaus. He stands on the shore of Galilee. He gives a short final commission: go, baptize, teach, and he ascends. That's it. For the most important 40 days in human history, the Western Bible gives us a handful of brief scenes. The Mashafa Kidan gives us the full 40 days. And in it, Jesus is not gentle. He is not understated. He appears as a divine king delivering urgent warnings to people he knows are about to face something they are not prepared for. His tone is not the tone of a teacher wrapping up a lesson. It is the tone of someone who can see exactly what is coming and is using every remaining moment to arm his disciples against it. The disciples were told to guard these teachings with their lives. For centuries, in monasteries above the clouds, they did. And it begins with a declaration so direct, so confrontational, that it reads like a challenge thrown directly at the next 2,000 years of Christian history. The weapon of his father, the first law in the Mashafa Kidan, is also the most uncomfortable. Jesus tells his disciples that his Father's weapon is not made by human hands, not forged from iron, not carried by soldiers. The weapon of his Father is compassion, the force of a spirit that builds rather than destroys. And then the passage says something that no Western canon has ever placed in the mouth of the risen Christ. Do not resort to violence in my name. Read that again. Do not resort to violence in my name. This is a man who has just returned from death. He has conquered the grave. He stands before his disciples with the full authority of divine power. And the first instruction he gives The very first law he lays down is this: whatever you do, do not use force on my behalf. In a world where the Crusades, the Inquisition, and centuries of religious warfare would eventually be carried out explicitly in the name of Jesus Christ, this lands like something detonating. He continues, "The Spirit will be your power, the heart will be your place of worship, love will be your only law." Here's what nobody talks about when these words come up. On the surface, they echo familiar things: the Sermon on the Mount, the teachings most Christians know. But what the Missionaries is doing is radical in a way the Western reading misses entirely. If the heart is the true place of worship, then what does that say about the massive stone cathedrals that were about to be built across the Roman world in his name? Places where access to God would be mediated by priests, by rituals, by men in institutional positions. If love is the only law, what does that say about the hundreds of doctrinal rules, the rigid theological walls, the hierarchical power structures that would come to define Western Christianity for the next 2 millennia? This is not a teaching that coexists peacefully with organized religious power. This is a teaching that makes organized religious power unnecessary. And that is precisely why what comes next is so disturbing. The prophecy against his own church. This is the part of the passage that Ethiopian clergy say was considered most dangerous. Not the cosmology, not the spiritual metaphysics, this section. Because here, Jesus does not speak in parables. He does not use metaphor. He delivers a direct, explicit prophecy about the institution that will be built in his name and what it will do to his message. He warns his disciples, "What I have taught you will be changed, not gradually, not by accident, deliberately. Many will come claiming to speak for him who have no genuine connection to him at all. His words will be twisted, reinterpreted, sold for personal advantage. In the years and centuries ahead, enormous structures of stone and gold will be erected, and those structures will be presented to the world as the houses of God, while actually serving the interests of the men who control them. The transformation of the human heart, which is the entire point, will be replaced by performance, by ritual, by spectacle designed to produce obedience rather than awakening." And here is the line the Ethiopian monks return to again and again. He tells his disciples, "Look for me in quiet places, in simple and humble spaces, because that is where my true message will remain." Think about what happened next. Within a few centuries of the resurrection, Christianity became the official state religion of the Roman Empire. The wandering teacher from Galilee became the figurehead of the most powerful institutional apparatus in Western history. Churches became political headquarters. Bishops became princes. The poor, whom Jesus had explicitly, repeatedly centered in his teaching, became the population that the institutional church most consistently failed. Ethiopian tradition does not call this an accident. It calls it the betrayal he saw coming, the one he warned his disciples about 40 days after rising from the dead. He stood before them and told them exactly what was going to happen to his name, and it happened anyway, almost exactly as he said. That is what the passage says, and it is not finished. The struggle between two flames. Now the Missionaries goes somewhere even deeper. This is where the post-resurrection teachings stop being institutional critique and become something that feels like it was written for right now. Jesus tells his disciples that his death was not what they thought it was. Death, he says, is not an ending. It is more like changing garments. The body is temporary clothing, material, impermanent, borrowed. When the body fades, the spirit continues, always, without interruption. That one idea changes the entire architecture of the faith. Instead of waiting for a singular resurrection at the end of time, the framework Western Christianity built everything around, the Ethiopian vision centers on the eternal, ongoing nature of the Spirit. The physical world becomes a temporary passage, not a permanent home. You are not your body. You are passing through. And then comes the teaching that resonates across every wisdom, tradition that has ever existed anywhere on earth. He says that every human being carries two inner flames, One flame reaches toward light, the other falls toward darkness. Every thought you have, every word you speak, every choice you make, all of it feeds one of those flames, shaping moment by moment which direction the soul is traveling. There is no neutral ground in this vision. You are always choosing. You are always feeding one flame or the other. The spiritual journey is not determined by which building you sit in on Sunday, which creed you recite, which ritual you perform. It is shaped by the daily, relentless choices you make when no one is watching. And then the hardest thing in the entire passage. The risen Christ describes a condition he calls living death. People who look alive, who move through the world, eat, speak, laugh, but who have allowed their inner light to go out. They filled the emptiness with pride, with the accumulation of wealth, with the hunger for status and power. From the outside, nothing looks wrong. On the inside, they dwell in something the text describes as a walking grave. You already know people like this. You may have been this. So have I. It doesn't feel like ancient scripture at all. It feels like a diagnosis of the present moment. And before you can fully absorb it, the passage delivers what may be its most explosive revelation yet. The architect of shadows. Here is where the Book of the Covenant says something that the Roman Church called the most dangerous idea in the ancient world. Jesus tells his disciples that the universe was shaped by two distinct forces. The first is the Father of light, the ultimate source of all genuine life, all love, all truth. The second is what the passage calls the architect of shadows, a secondary creator, blinded by its own arrogance, responsible for building the physical world as we experience it. The physical world, an illusion, beautiful on the surface, hollow at its core. In this vision, the architect of shadows holds dominion over everything the human eye can see and want: wealth, power, empires, great monuments, and most of all, fear. Those who align with the shadow architect gain tremendous influence in the physical realm, but they do so inside a reality that is only partially real. And here is the danger Jesus names explicitly. Future generations will confuse the architect of shadows with the genuine divine. The God of worldly power will be worshipped as the God of love. Stop and sit with that for a moment. This idea has a name scholars of early Christianity know well: Gnosticism. The Gnostic tradition, which held that the material world was created by a lesser, flawed being, and that Christ came to liberate human souls from its grip, was not a marginal movement in early Christianity. It was everywhere. It drew followers across the ancient world. And then the Roman Church hunted it with systematic ferocity, declared it the worst heresy, and destroyed every text it could find. In 1945, a sealed clay jar was discovered in the Egyptian desert near Nag Hammadi. Inside, scrolls that had survived the purge, ancient texts hidden in the ground for over 1,000 years. Every single one of them centered on the same idea. The creator of the physical world is not the supreme God, and Christ was sent to free human souls from the illusion. Condemned as heresy in the West, quietly preserved in Ethiopia, never declared forbidden, never erased. And if this is what the passage has already revealed, what does it say about the battle being fought right now inside every single person alive? The invisible war within. The final teaching in this section of the Mashafa Kidan is the most intimate and, in some ways, the most devastating. In a text known as the Heavenly Scrolls, Jesus reveals a truth about the nature of every individual human life from the moment of birth until the moment of death. He says, every person is accompanied by two invisible presences. The first is a guardian, a spiritual companion guiding the soul toward light, clarity, and truth. The second is a deceiver, working in the shadows of the mind, feeding doubt, confusion, resentment, and fear into the spaces where certainty used to live. They are with you right now, in every decision you have made today, in the quiet hours when you are most honest with yourself, in the loud hours when you are most likely to talk yourself into something you know is wrong. And then Jesus says, the thing that strips away every comfortable religious institution ever built. No temple can fight this battle for you. No leader, no ritual, no organization of any kind. The war between light and darkness is fought entirely inside you. Only a conscious, awake mind, one that recognizes the battle for what it is, can choose the right direction through it. Here is why this was buried. You cannot charge admission to something a person can only find themselves. You cannot build a hierarchy around a truth that is equally accessible to every human being alive. You cannot sell what the passage says every soul already carries. A church cannot give you what the passage says you were born with. And the monk in his monastery, reading this passage for the 100th time, knows exactly what it costs to keep it, the gospel they buried deepest. There is one more document in the Ethiopian tradition, and it is the most controversial thing we are going to discuss today. A text known as the Gospel of Peace contains a version of the Jesus story that diverges so completely from the Western account that it was not merely excluded from the canon. It was actively hunted, suppressed, and kept from public knowledge for centuries. Scholars who have encountered it describe its core message as something powerful religious institutions found existentially threatening. Not just inconvenient, existentially threatening. In this gospel, the crucifixion does not happen as the world was told. Following the betrayal, Jesus does not die on the cross. Instead, he retreats quietly into the wilderness, in the tradition of the ancient prophets who pursued solitude and illumination away from cities and crowds. He spends years in solitude. He continues teaching. He does not die in agony. He does not rise on the third day. He simply goes on, living and teaching a way of life built entirely on harmony, balance, and love. The message of the living Jesus in this text is not a theology at all. It is a practice: love, simplicity, healing, unity. He calls the earth a nurturing mother. He calls God a caring father. He calls rivers cleansing angels and trees life-giving angels. He walks barefoot through fields, blessing those who plant seeds. He teaches that heaven is not a place you go to. It is a quality of presence you can inhabit in every moment of your life. Why was this the message they buried deepest? Because in the 4th century, the Roman Empire was fracturing. Emperor Constantine needed a unifying force, a single dominant faith with central authority, capable of holding an enormous and unstable empire together. A message built around a living teacher who says the heart is the true sanctuary, love is the only law, and nature reflects the divine. That doesn't hold an empire, it dismantles one. It makes every person their own center of spiritual gravity. A suffering hero who died for humanity's sins, by contrast, requires an institution to maintain, interpret, and control. It requires priests, bishops, councils, and gatekeepers. It requires exactly the power structure that Rome was already positioned to provide. And so, the crucified Jesus became the official story. The living Jesus, the one walking barefoot through fields, calling trees angels, saying heaven is available right now, was left in the keeping of Ethiopia, the land chosen to hold secrets. None of this is coincidence. Ethiopia's role as the keeper of suppressed sacred knowledge is rooted in a history that stretches back more than 1,000 years before the birth of Jesus. This is a land that has understood itself as a guardian of the sacred since before any of this began. The Ethiopian people traced their spiritual lineage not to the apostles, not to the early church fathers, but to Solomon himself. The Queen of Sheba, known in Ethiopian tradition as Makeda, traveled from Africa to Jerusalem, not merely as a political figure, but as a seeker of something she could not find at home. Her encounter with Solomon produced a son, Menelik I, founder of Ethiopia's royal Solomonic dynasty, a lineage of sacred stewardship that never ended. When Menelik came of age, he journeyed to Jerusalem to meet his father, and when he returned to Ethiopia, he brought with him something no other nation on earth has ever claimed to possess: the Ark of the Covenant, the golden chest that housed the tablets of the divine law. The most sacred object in all of Israelite history was, according to Ethiopian tradition, taken from the temple in Jerusalem and carried to Africa. where it has remained ever since. It is said to rest today in a modest church in Aksum. A single monk, one man who has taken a vow of celibacy and dedicated his entire life to this singular purpose, guards it. No one else is permitted to see it. When he dies, another monk takes his place. The guardianship does not pause. It does not pass to a committee. It does not get discussed. It simply continues, generation after generation, in the same quiet building, in the same ancient city, in the same country that has been holding the world's most important secrets for longer than most nations have existed. This is the land that kept the Ark. This is the land that kept the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees when Rome was hunting every copy it could find. This is the land where monks copied the Mashafa Kidan by hand in the thin air of highland monasteries, passing it forward to the next generation with the same gravity they passed the guardianship of the Ark. When Jesus' most dangerous teachings needed a place to survive, when what he said in those 40 days after the resurrection proved too radical for Rome to absorb, Ethiopia was already there, already keeping things, already carrying what the empire had decided the world wasn't allowed to have. That is the hidden story, not a replacement for what you know. The chapters that were torn out before the book was handed to you, you now know what the monk knows. You know what the passage says. The question is not whether you believe all of it. The question is why you were never given the chance to decide for yourself. The monk in Aksum will be replaced when he dies. The manuscripts will be copied by the next generation of hands. The guardianship never ends, because some truths are too important to leave unguarded. If what you just heard matters to you, subscribe. Not because this channel needs the number, but because there is more being kept that hasn't been brought into the light yet. And the people who were never supposed to hear any of this are exactly the ones who deserve to hear what comes next. Leave your thoughts in the comments. We read every one.